So, in 2015, a high school student in Texas opened up a brand new, state-approved McGraw-Hill World Geography textbook.
Oh, I know exactly what you're talking about.
Right, yeah. So they flipped to a section on the transatlantic slave trade, and right there, printed in this glossy, authoritative hardcover book, was a caption that described the millions of human beings brought from Africa to southern agricultural plantations, not as enslaved people, not as victims of forced labor, but as workers.
Workers, yeah. I mean, as if millions of people had just, applied for a job, packed their bags, and immigrated for better wages.
Exactly, workers. And really, the only reason this ever made national news is because a Houston area mother just happened to be looking over her son's shoulder, saw it, took a photo, and posted online.
Thank goodness she did.
Yeah, but I mean, it forces you to ask a massive, just deeply uncomfortable question, right?
Yeah.
Like before that book ever reached that teenager's desk, how many highly paid editors, PhD-level historians, review board members, and state education officials read that word workers and just signed off on it?
It's staggering to think about. It reveals this complete failure of the system. But, as we're going to explore today, it might actually be the system working exactly as it was designed to.
And that is the core of our deep dives today. We usually treat the history we learn in school like a natural landscape, Like we just assume what is in the book is simply the objective record of what happened.
Right, like it's just facts.
Yeah, just facts.
Yeah.
But today, we are going to trace the journey of a history textbook from a multi-million-dollar corporate boardroom all the way to a classroom desk. We're operating off this really fascinating 2026 position paper by Jimamat Dogan McWilson.
Ah, yes, the master student in Chematophricology.
That's the one. The paper is titled Government-Funded Public Education, the Books Used and Whose History is Taught.
And McWilson's research really just strips away that illusion of a neutral historical record. We are looking at a landscape that is heavily engineered, heavily debated, and driven by financial and political forces most people just, never even think about.
Now look, before we jump in, a quick note. Today's sources contain some highly politically charged content, touching on both left-wing and right-wing policies and viewpoints.
Very much so.
Yeah. So we want to be crystal clear with you. We are not taking any sides here. We aren't endorsing the viewpoints of these policies or politicians. Our goal is simply to impartially report on the content provided in our source material and convey the ideas and facts as they are presented so you can understand the landscape.
And understanding the mechanics of that landscape is absolutely crucial. Because what we're going to see is how a single line edited in a textbook in Texas or California doesn't just affect the students in those states.
It's way bigger than that.
Oh, massively. The financial mechanics of the publishing industry mean that those local political decisions fundamentally alter the worldview of a student sitting in a classroom in Maine or Idaho or anywhere else.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with the sheer mechanics of how a book physically gets onto a student's desk. Because public school history isn't just an academic pursuit, right? I mean, it is a massive multi-million-dollar industry. So how does a school actually buy a book?
It all comes down to the economics of education, specifically a mechanism called the adoption system.
The adoption system.
Right. And to understand this, you have to realize that the United States is really unique in that it does not have a single unified national curriculum.
Like the federal government doesn't just hand down a history book.
Exactly. The federal government does not write K-12 history books. Instead, textbook selection splits into two very distinct models. So according to the Education Commission of the states, 19 states, plus Washington, D.C., operate as what we call adoption states.
Okay, let's break that down for someone who has never, worked in a school district. What does adoption state actually mean on the ground? Like, how does that work?
Well, in an adoption state, the power is highly centralized. A state agency, usually the State Board of Education, holds the master key.
Okay.
They basically put out a call to publishers saying, hey, we need a new 8th grade history textbook.
In the publisher's scramble.
Oh, yeah. They spend millions developing these books and submit them. Then the state appoints review panels, and these panels are usually nominated by the state commissioner of education or the governor.
So they're appointed by politicians.
Yes, they are made up of academics, educators, and crucially, political appointees and parents.
Right, so they aren't just panels of, nonpartisan historians sitting in a room. They have political mandates.
Exactly. These panels conduct massive, substantive reviews of the submitted texts against the state's specific educational standards. They can demand edits, they can flag passages, and they ultimately make a recommendation to the full state board, which then casts a final vote.
And if a book passes?
If it survives this gauntlet and gets on the state-approved list, local schools in that state can use state funds to buy it.
Okay, I see where this is going.
Right, because if a book is not on the list, a local school generally cannot use their state funding to purchase it.
Wow. So it is an incredibly powerful financial bottleneck.
Huge. It dictates millions of dollars.
Got it. So that's the 19 adoption states. What about the other 31 states?
The rest are non-adoption states. That means they leave textbook selection entirely up to individual local school districts.
So a local school board in a town in, say, Ohio or Massachusetts can theoretically buy whatever book they want.
Keyword there being theoretically.
Right. Theoretically.
Yeah.
But here is where the invisible hand comes in. And this honestly blew my mind when I read the data. Because of the sheer economic size of certain adoption states, publishers do not write 50 different books for 50 different states.
No, it would be a logistical and financial nightmare. I mean, you were talking about hiring 50 different teams of authors, running 50 different editorial processes.
50 printing pipelines.
Exactly, managing all that distribution. The profit margins in educational publishing are surprisingly tight. They just cannot afford to do that.
So instead, they write to the biggest buyers, which historically have been a big two, right? California and Texas.
Historically, yes.
But the paper points out that in recent years, Florida has really aggressively solidified its place, creating what is now known in the industry as the Big Three: Texas, California, and Florida.
Yes, the big three.
And to understand the leverage these three states have, you really just have to look at the money.
the revenue numbers are just staggering.
Truly staggering. Our source cites APM Research Lab data, looking at just a single one-year window from March 2020 to March 2021. The Association of American Publishers recorded roughly $8.5 million in K-12 purchases in Florida alone.
Wow.
Yeah. And California brought in $3.9 million, and Texas was at $2.3 million.
And when you combine just those three states, they account for roughly 25% of all K-12 publisher revenue for that entire year.
A quarter of the market.
1/4 of the entire national market is dictated by the centralized review boards of just 3 states.
Dr. Max Altman from the Southern Education Foundation puts it brilliantly in the paper. He explains that publishers, quote, need to create books that are going to be approved by those large states.
The financial imperative is absolute.
Right. And he points out that this relatively tiny group of people, like literally just the political appointees who sit on the textbook approval boards in Austin, Texas, or Tallahassee, Florida, they have a massive, disproportionate effect on what students across the country as a whole are able to learn.
Because the profit motive essentially forces standardization. A publisher like McGraw-Hill or Pearson simply cannot afford to lose the Florida contract.
Yeah, that's game over for that book.
Exactly. If Florida says, we want this historical event framed this way, or we want this term removed, the publisher is highly likely to alter the master text. They aren't going to run a separate, distinct printing press just for a smaller non-adoption state like, say, Vermont.
Right.
Vermont is just going to get the book that was scrubbed and tailored to pass the Florida Review Board.
You know, I was thinking about this, and it feels exactly like how Hollywood blockbuster movies are produced.
Oh, that's an interesting comparison.
Think about it. When a major studio makes a $200 million superhero movie, they know they needed to pass the international censorship boards in massive markets like China to make their money back.
Right. They can't afford to lose that box office revenue.
Exactly. So they change the script for everyone. If a scene might get the movie banned in a massive market, they don't just cut it for that one country. They often just cut the scene entirely before the movie even hits theaters in the US or Europe.
Yes. The script gets changed at the source.
Yeah. The indie filmmakers might make whatever they want, but the massive, ubiquitous blockbusters are heavily sanitized. Textbook publishers are doing the exact same thing, but the censors are state review boards in Texas and Florida.
That is a phenomenal way to understand the mechanism. And, you know, the leverage these state boards have is not just theoretical. It is exercised with brutal, immediate financial consequences for the publishers.
Yeah, let's talk about that 2022 Florida math textbook rejection, because it blew my mind.
It's a perfect example of how aggressive this vetting process has become. So in 2022, the Florida Department of Education rejected 41% of all submitted K-12 math textbooks.
41%?
Yes, that was 54 different titles sent back to the publishers, including 71% of all K-5 math materials.
Okay, I have to stop you there, because for someone outside the education bubble, this just sounds absurd. How do you reject a math textbook? Math is math. I mean, 2 + 2 is 4. How does a math book fail a political review?
It's a great question, and it really comes down to how modern textbooks are structured. The state rejected them over alleged references to critical race theory, or CRT, the Common Core, and social emotional learning, which is often referred to as SEL.
Okay, let's define those really quickly because those terms get thrown around a lot on the news without any practical context. What does social emotional learning actually look like in a math book?
Sure. So, social emotional learning in a textbook might be a word problem that, instead of just asking a student to strictly calculate a percentage, frames the problem around a scenario involving, say, empathy, cooperation, or understanding different perspectives.
Okay, like what?
For example, a word problem might involve students working together to resolve a conflict while sharing resources, and the math is just embedded in how they divide those resources.
Oh, okay. And what about the CRT claims?
Regarding CRT, it might be a statistical analysis problem that uses real-world data showing racial disparities in income or housing, and it uses that to teach students how to calculate statistical variance.
I see. So it's not the equation itself that's the issue. It's the framing of the word problem or the actual data sets they use to teach the math concept.
Precisely. And the Florida Review Board decided that framing violated their new state standards. Now, put yourself in the shoes of a publisher.
Terrifying.
Right, if you just spent millions of dollars developing a K-5 math curriculum, and you instantly lose 41% of your potential sales in one of the biggest markets in the country, that is a catastrophic hit to your bottom line.
So you are going to change the word problem.
You are absolutely going to change the word problem. And our source notes, it happens in Texas, too.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Recently, Texas approved a set of health materials only after they forced the publisher to entirely strip out any references to gender fluidity.
Wow.
The mechanism is clear. If you want the multi-million-dollar contract, you sanitize the content to exactly match the political and cultural mandates of the state board.
But, this brings up a huge question for me. And I really want to push back on this dynamic between the big three.
Okay, go for it.
If California is one of the big three, and California is known for having a highly progressive state government, why don't the publishers just write a progressive, inclusive book, force Texas and Florida to deal with it, and bank on the California revenue? Why does it seem like the conservative policy always wins the tiebreaker when it comes to national sanitization?
That is a highly perceptive question, and it really gets to the structural differences in how these states wield their power.
Okay.
We will get into the specific laws a bit later, but the short answer is that states like Florida and Texas have built incredibly aggressive, punitive mechanisms.
It's fining people.
Yes, like the Stop Woke Act, which actively fines or penalizes publishers and teachers for including certain content. California, on the other hand, might pass mandates encouraging progressive content, but as we'll see, they often lack the centralized budgetary hammer to actually enforce it. Plus, just from a corporate liability standpoint, it is always, quote-unquote, safer to omit a controversial topic entirely than to include it and risk a total ban in a massive market. Omission is quiet, inclusion is loud and risky.
That makes total sense. I mean, it's the path of least resistance for a corporation that's really just trying to sell a product.
Exactly.
But it completely shatters the illusion of local district control.
It really does.
Like if I live in a non-adoption state, say Ohio, my local school board might pride itself on being fiercely independent, right? They hold local elections, they debate what goes into the classroom. But if they're just choosing their textbooks from a catalog of options that have already been scrubbed and sanitized to appease Tallahassee and Austin, doesn't that mean local control is basically a myth?
Yeah.
Aren't they just subject to the same state mandate by proxy?
That is the exact paradox of the American education system today. Local control is largely an illusion when the menu of options you are choosing from has been pre-curated by the economic demands of the big three.
It's like picking between two things that are exactly the same.
Right. You might get the freedom to choose between Book A and Book B, but if both Book A and Book B were written to survive the Texas adoption gauntlet, your choice is functionally meaningless in terms of historical narrative.
It is a phenomenal amount of hidden power. And because these publishers are writing to secure these massive multi-million-dollar contracts, we really need to look at the actual text that survives this financial gauntlet and makes it into classrooms.
Yes. What's actually in these books?
Exactly. So, segment 2, McWilson's paper provides a really illuminating breakdown of the major titles dictating the market right now.
Right, the heavy hitters. We're
Mhm.
talking about McGraw-Hill's United States History and Geography, TCI's History Alive series, Savas, which was formerly Pearson, their book, The American Nation.
Yep.
Also Houghton Mifflin Harcourt's American History, and elementary programs like Studies Weekly.
These are literally the books sitting in lockers from coast to coast.
Yes, and when independent, nonpartisan groups actually take the time to audit these specific books, the findings are honestly shocking.
Yeah, let's get into the audits.
The paper relies on several major ones, but let's start with how these books handle the most foundational, deeply embedded trauma in American history: slavery and the Civil War.
Yes, let's do it. The Southern Poverty Law Center, the SPLC,
Yeah.
did a massive comprehensive audit on this called Teaching Hard History, American
A
Slavery.
huge project.
Oh, massive. They didn't just read the books. They surveyed roughly 1,800 K-12 social studies teachers and 1,000 high school seniors, and they ran a dozen of these popular textbooks against a very specific 30-point rubric.
And the results were abysmal across the board.
How bad?
Well, not a single textbook scored above 70% on their rubric. 5 of the major textbooks scored below 25%.
Ouch.
And specifically, state-produced texts from Texas and Alabama scored an astonishingly low 6 out of 87 possible points in a weighted scale.
Wait, I need to pause here. How do you get a 6 out of 87? Like, what does that rubric actually measure mechanically? What are these books failing to do?
So the rubric measures whether a book is teaching the actual mechanisms of slavery or if it's just treating it as a sad, isolated footnote.
Yep.
To score points, a book needs to clearly articulate things like the daily lived reality of enslaved people, their culture, their resistance. It needs to explain the legal mechanisms that upheld slavery, like the Fugitive Slave Act or the Dred Scott decision.
Or structural stuff.
Yes, the structural stuff. It needs to explicitly explain how the massive economic engine of cotton drove the expansion of the country. And, crucially, it needs to directly connect the institution of slavery to the primary cause of the Civil War.
So a 6 out of 87 means?
Books that score a 6 out of 87 are utterly failing to explain how and why slavery happened. They are basically just passively acknowledging that it existed.
And the real-world consequence of that failure is profound. Because of this sanitized teaching, the survey found that only 8% of high school seniors could identify slavery as the central cause of the Civil War.
Let that sink in. 8%.
It's wild.
The overwhelming majority of high school seniors fundamentally misunderstand the defining conflict of their own nation's history.
It is a structural failure of historical education. And, what I found fascinating in the paper is that it is not just the students who are lost. The teachers are incredibly frustrated by this, too.
Oh, deeply.
Yeah, the audit noted that 58% of teachers reported being deeply dissatisfied with their own textbook's treatment of slavery. They know the tools they're being given are broken.
Right. They're on the front lines.
Maureen Costello, the former director of the SPLC, had this incredibly powerful quote summarizing the issue. She said, quote, "We celebrate the heroes who escaped slavery long before we explain to children what slavery was."
It is a very deliberate framing. You focus on the Underground Railroad, you focus on Harriet Tubman, which, are undeniably heroic, essential narratives, but you do so without ever explaining the brutal, systemic, legal, and economic apparatus they were escaping from.
You focus on the escape, not the prison.
Exactly. The 2019 SPLC update found that none of the state standards they reviewed explicitly named white supremacy as the justification for slavery, and only 4% framed slavery as a system of racial power.
That's crazy.
The rest treated almost like a natural disaster, just some tragic historical event that happened to occur devoid of human architects or beneficiaries.
And this pattern of erasure and sanitization, it isn't just limited to slavery. The audits cover the broader spectrum of American history, and the mechanism repeats itself over and over.
Yes, it's systemic.
Look at the UNIDO US and Johns Hopkins Institute for Education Policy study from 2023. They examined 6 common high school history textbooks, specifically for their coverage of Latino and Hispanic history.
And what did they find?
They established a baseline of 222 defined knowledge topics that are essential to understanding the Latino experience in America. Do you know how many of those topics were covered in any real depth across all 6 books?
It's a shockingly low number.
28. Out of 222 topics, only 28 were covered. That is just 13%.
And again, we have to look at the mechanics of what is missing and what is included, because the qualitative nature of that 13% coverage is just as damaging as the quantitative omission.
How so?
Well, the narrative heavily skewed toward oppression rather than contribution. The textbooks will briefly mention things like the Mexican-American War or perhaps border conflicts, but they completely omit the vibrant, continuous contributions of Latino Americans to the culture, economy, and legal structure of the country.
Right. Like, where is the Bracero program? Where is Mendez v. Westminster, which was the precursor to Brown v. Board of Education?
Nowhere to be found.
The source notes that across 2 centuries of covered history, the only consistent Latino breakthrough moment that appeared across these major textbooks was Justice Sonia Sotomayor's Supreme Court confirmation.
One breakthrough moment in 200 years of history. It just creates a vacuum in the student's mind.
And it gets even worse when you look at the Native American audits.
Yes, the NCAI findings.
The National Congress of American Indians found a stark, almost total erasure. They found that 87% of state history standards omit Native American history after the year 1900.
87%.
Furthermore, 27 states omit Native Americans from their K-12 curricula entirely. Education Week actually corroborated this, noting that Native peoples largely, quote, disappear from textbooks after the 1890s.
What's fascinating here is that this is a specific type of historiographical mechanism at play.
Okay, unpack that.
By ending the narrative in 1890, usually around the Wounded Knee Massacre, the textbooks reinforce this incredibly damaging misconception that Native nations and indigenous cultures are just historical relics.
Like they only exist in the past.
Exactly. It traps them in the 19th century in the minds of students. It completely erases the 20th and 21st century struggles for tribal sovereignty, the American Indian movement, or just the simple fact that Native Americans are contemporary, living people shaping the country today.
So if we step back and look at all these independent audits, the SPLC on slavery, Unidos US on Latino history, the NCAI on Native American erasure, they all point to a unified editorial philosophy.
Yes, they do.
And this is where the paper brings in the Zinn Education Project to explain why this happens. The Zinn Project argues that the conventional national narrative in these textbooks is presented essentially as a family history.
And the family history concept is vital to understanding the psychology of textbook editing.
How so?
Well, think about it. The primary purpose of a family history is to maintain unity and pride. It's about social cohesion. Therefore, a family history purposefully conceals the fierce conflicts of interest between the conquerors and the conquered, between masters and slaves, between capital and labor.
It smooths everything over.
Right. It creates a sanitized, unified, Eurocentric worldview where everyone is ultimately on the same team moving toward progress.
You know, I love that analogy, but I feel like we need to push it further. Because you don't bring up the worst things your ancestors did at the Thanksgiving table if you want everyone to get along.
No, you definitely don't.
But a nation's history isn't just a Thanksgiving dinner where we all politely pass the potatoes. A nation's history is the recipe book that explains why some people have a feast and others have nothing.
Oh, that's a brilliant extension of the metaphor. You are hiding the recipe.
Exactly. If you treat it like a polite family history, you aren't just keeping the peace. You are actively hiding the mechanisms of how the modern world was built.
Yes. And by hiding the recipe, this family history approach strips agency away from anyone who isn't the primary protagonist, which, in these books, is generally the Euro-American establishment.
Right.
For example, the American Historical Association formally responded to Florida's new standards, noting that they completely ignore the pre-existing expertise of enslaved Africans.
Explain that mechanism. Like, what does ignoring their pre-existing expertise actually do to a student's understanding?
Well, the AHA pointed out that enslaved people brought highly specialized rice cultivation knowledge directly from West Africa.
Oh, interesting.
It was their intellectual capital, their agricultural engineering that built the massive wealth of the Carolina Lowcountry. But by omitting that intellectual contribution, the textbooks strip these individuals of their agency, their intelligence, and their humanity before they were even enslaved.
They just become a blank slate.
Exactly. They are just presented as a blank slate of unskilled labor that was acted upon by European enslavers. It fundamentally alters how a student perceives the intellectual capacity of an entire continent.
Which brings me back to my earlier question. If these massive publishing companies like McGraw-Hill and Pearson have panels of esteemed PhD-level historians advising them, how do they end up with books that score 6 out of 87 points?
It's the multi-million-dollar question.
Right. Like, how do you miss the cause of the Civil War? I refuse to believe it is just bureaucratic incompetence. There are way too many smart people involved for this to be an accident.
Well, it is not an accident. The evidence strongly suggests it is a deliberate editorial choice. It is the profit motive overriding academic rigor.
The money talks.
The publishers know exactly what will trigger rejection from a politically appointed review board in Texas or Florida. So they proactively soften the edges, they use passive voice, they remove specific inflammatory words.
Right.
For instance, the AHA noted that the word racism only appeared once across 14 pages of Florida's African American history standards. They edit for commercial survival.
And sometimes that safe editing process, that commercial survival instinct, fails spectacularly in the public eye.
It certainly does.
Which leads us perfectly into segment 3 of the paper. We have two major modern controversies that drag this entire sanitization process out of the invisible boardroom and into the daylight.
Yes, the source highlights two very specific case studies where the text on the page caused a national uproar because the sanitization went too far, even for a casual observer.
Let's go back to the story I opened the show with. Case Study 1, Texas, in 2015.
The McGraw-Hill World Geography textbook.
Exactly. So there was a caption in this book describing the transatlantic slave trade, and it explicitly said that the trade, quote, brought millions of workers from Africa to the southern United States to work on agricultural plantations.
Workers! The mechanism of passive voice and euphemism used to its absolute extreme.
Right. And again, the only reason this blew up was because a Houston area parent, Roni Dean Burren, caught it and posted it online.
And it went everywhere.
It went incredibly viral, and it forced McGraw-Hill into a massive public relations crisis. They had to publicly acknowledge the error and commit to revising the language in future printings to accurately reflect forced migration and slave labor.
Which is what it should have said all along.
But it exposes the entire bureaucratic chain, doesn't it? How does a publisher print thousands of copies of a book with that word?
It happens because the editorial mandate isn't, be as historically accurate as possible. The mandate is make sure this doesn't offend the conservative reviewers in Texas.
Ah, right.
When you instruct editors to soften the language around slavery to make it less abrasive, you eventually end up with a word like workers. It speaks to the systemic nature of the sanitization.
And Case Study 2 is even more recent and honestly even more overt. This was Florida in 2023.
Oh boy.
Yeah, this wasn't a publisher making an editorial mistake. This was the state itself writing new African American history standards.
The standards themselves.
Right. The standards explicitly stated that instruction must include how, quote, slaves develop skills which, in some instances, could be applied for their personal benefit.
Personal benefit.
Yes, personal benefit. The backlash was immediate and intense. But what fascinates me is the mechanics of how the state tried to defend this. Because critics immediately highlighted massive factual errors in the state's defense of this standard.
Right, because when you mandate an ideological conclusion, in this case, that slavery had some sort of silver lining of personal benefit, you force educators to go searching for historical evidence that just doesn't exist.
They're working backward from the conclusion.
Exactly. To prove this personal benefit point, the state actually cited a blacksmith named Ned Cobb as an example of an enslaved person who benefited from his skills.
Wait, okay, explain the Ned Cobb story. Who was he?
So Ned Cobb was a prominent black farmer and a member of the Sharecroppers Union. A state held him up as a shining example of a slave leveraging his skills. The only problem is the sheer mechanical reality of timelines.
Uh-oh.
Ned Cobb was born in 1885.
2 decades after the abolition of slavery.
Precisely. The state was so desperate to force this narrative of personal benefit into the curriculum to appease their political base that they failed to do the most basic historical fact-checking.
They cited a man who wasn't even born yet.
They cited a man who was never even enslaved to prove that slavery was beneficial.
That is unbelievable. It's a complete collapse of historical methodology. The political fallout was massive. Then Vice President Kamala Harris traveled to Florida and called the standards an attempt to gaslight the country.
And the Florida Education Association called it a big step backward.
Right. So here's where it gets really interesting. If we synthesize these two events, the 2015 Texas workers caption and the 2023 Florida personal benefit standards, we see the exact same mechanism at play.
It's the publisher profit motives and the political goals of the state adoption boards. They dictate the inclusion of these very specific, softened historical narratives.
Exactly.
Describing enslaved people as workers, or desperately searching for a silver lining of personal benefit, these are direct attempts to make a brutal, undeniable history palatable to review boards who are demanding a quote-unquote patriotic family history.
I want you to imagine trying to teach the history of any other major, violent, global conflict with these kinds of mandated constraints.
It would be impossible.
Think about it. Imagine trying to teach the history of World War II or the American Revolution, but you are legally and contractually obligated by the State Board of Education to find a personal benefit for the victims of those conflicts.
That's absurd.
It structurally warps the reality of the event. It turns history from an academic discipline into a public relations exercise.
It absolutely does. It moves the curriculum away from historical inquiry and transforms it into ideological conditioning.
Right.
You are no longer teaching students how to analyze primary sources, understand complex causality, or grapple with human suffering. You are teaching them how to memorize and regurgitate a state-sanctioned myth.
And these textbook controversies, the workers' caption, the Ned Cobb embarrassment, as wild as they were really just the opening skirmishes.
Just the beginning.
Because the paper shows that since 2023, the fight has evolved dramatically. It is no longer just about catching a bad caption in a geography book. It has escalated into passing sweeping, comprehensive state laws that dictate exactly what can and cannot be spoken aloud in a classroom.
Yes.
We are seeing a massive clash between the differing policy approaches of our big three states, setting up a real tale of two states, Florida and California.
And the contrast in the specific policy tools these states use is incredibly revealing.
Okay, let's break them down.
Let's look at Florida's approach first, which is a highly restrictive, punitive model. In 2022, Florida passed what was colloquially known as the Stop Woke Act, and subsequently passed SB 266.
Let's define the Stop Woke Act in practical terms. What does it actually do to a teacher in a classroom?
Mechanically, these laws aggressively restrict how race, systemic racism, and related concepts can be taught. The law essentially dictates that instruction cannot make a student feel guilt, anguish, or other forms of psychological distress on account of their race.
But, how is that even possible? How do you teach the brutality of American slavery or the Jim Crow era or the lynching of Emmett Till without causing a student to feel anguish?
You can't. And that is exactly the point. The law uses the subjective feeling of a student, or more likely their parents, as a weapon to chill instruction.
I see.
Because teachers fear losing their licenses and school districts fear massive lawsuits, they simply choose to avoid the topics entirely. It uses the threat of legal action to enforce omission.
Self-censorship out of fear.
Yes, and Florida used that hard power almost immediately on a national stage. In January 2023, the Florida Department of Education outright rejected the College Board's new Advanced Placement, or AP, African American Studies course.
Let's break down the College Board dynamic. For those who aren't familiar, the College Board is not some small, radical curriculum group.
No, not at all.
They are a massive, entrenched national nonprofit organization. They run the SATs. They run all the AP testing across the country. They are a pillar of the American education establishment.
Right.
So when Florida rejected their course, claiming it was inexplicably contrary to Florida law, what did the College Board do? Did they use their massive national leverage to hold their ground?
They capitulated.
Wow.
Yeah. The College Board subsequently released a revised framework for the AP course that systematically scrubbed 19 different topics.
19.
They removed essential works by prominent Black scholars like Kimberly Crenshaw and Bell Hooks. They moved contemporary, vital topics like Black Lives Matter and the debate over reparations out of the required testable curriculum and relegated them into an optional research project.
And anyone who has ever been in a high school knows exactly what an optional research project means.
What does it mean?
It means the teacher doesn't have time for it, it won't be on the exam, and it will never get taught.
Exactly. It's a bureaucratic burial.
It's wild. Florida complained, and this massive national organization just caved. It perfectly validates what McWilson was arguing in the paper. A massive national curriculum developer bent to the political and financial will of a single adoption state. Florida complained, and the national curriculum changed for everyone.
It is the ultimate proof of concept for the adoption state model's national power. The College Board knew they couldn't afford to lose the AP testing fees from every high school in Florida.
Right.
And Florida's restrictive approach doesn't stop at curriculum frameworks. PEN, America's 2024-2025 Index of School Book Bans, reports that Florida leads the entire nation in book bans.
Really, number one.
By far. They are a massive driver behind the 6,870 banning instances documented just in that single school year alone. PEN specifically noted that these bans disproportionately target books representing people of color and LGBTQ+ individuals. It is a systematic removal of specific identities from the school library.
Okay, so that is the Florida approach. Aggressive legislation, using subjective distress to chill teaching, outright rejection of national AP materials, and leading the nation in book bans. Now let's flip to the other coast and look at California.
Right, the inclusive model.
They took a completely different approach, an inclusive approach. But the paper shows that the mechanics of their policy make it deeply flawed in execution.
Yes. California tried to mandate inclusivity through legislation. So in 2021, they passed AB 101, which made California the very first state to require an ethnic studies course for high school graduation.
That's a huge deal.
It was. The plan was a gradual phase-in, requiring districts to offer the course starting in the 2025-2026 school year.
So we're in that target year right now. What happened?
Well, here is where the mechanics of state budgets collide with curriculum goals. There was a massive catch in the law. Both the mandate to offer the course and the eventual graduation requirement are entirely contingent on state funding appropriations. The state has to provide the money to hire the teachers and buy the materials. But when the 2025-2026 budget cycle rolled around, the state of California was facing a massive $2.9 billion budget shortfall.
Oh, wow. So what happened to the funding for the ethnic studies mandate? Did it get cut?
It simply wasn't provided at the scale needed. The California Department of Finance estimated that full implementation of the mandate would cost roughly $272 million.
Okay, and what did they actually get?
To date, only $50 million has been allocated.
Oh, that's not even close.
Right. And because the funding isn't there, the mandate is not legally in effect. It is stalled. It exists on paper as a progressive ideal, but not in practice in the classroom.
I have to point out a stark irony here.
Yeah.
We constantly view California and Florida as absolute polar opposites in this national culture war over education, right?
They are generally framed that way, yes.
But look at the practical reality on the ground. If Florida is actively passing punitive laws and banning content, and California is passing progressive, inclusive mandates, but refusing to actually fund them so they never happen, aren't students in both states ultimately missing out on this history? I mean, structurally, is an unfunded mandate really any better than an outright ban if the end result is exactly the same? The student doesn't learn the material.
That is a brilliant point, and it perfectly highlights the weakness of relying on legislative mandates without budgetary backing. It goes back to our earlier discussion about leverage.
Right.
Florida uses the hard power of state adoption, the power of the purse, and the threat of legal liability to eliminate content. California uses legislative mandates to encourage content. But because California relies on local district adoption for high schools, remember, they only do centralized state adoption for K-8, they lack the centralized budgetary hammer to force it through at the high school level when state money is tight. The policy remains a theoretical talking point rather than an educational reality.
And we absolutely cannot forget about Texas in this Big Three dynamic.
No, we cannot.
The paper notes that in September 2025 and officially adopting in June 2026, Texas moved to implement a totally new social studies framework. How does their new approach fit into this?
Well, Texas is taking a very deliberate structural approach. Their new framework significantly expands the required instruction time for Texas state history and U.S. history, while simultaneously shrinking the coverage of world history and global cultures.
So they're narrowing the lens.
Dramatically. And it does so with a very specific chronological framework that heavily anchors on an 8th grade capstone course. That course explicitly emphasizes liberty, self-government, free enterprise, and constitutional principles.
Which, on its face, sounds very patriotic.
It does.
But it prompted one of the state board members, Stacey Childs, to ask a very pointed question during the debates. She asked, quote, "When do people that look like me get to learn about themselves before the 5th grade?"
Her question cuts to the core of the issue. Space in an educational curriculum is a zero-sum game.
Right, there are only so many hours in a day.
Exactly. There are only so many hours in a school day. If you structurally expand the time spent on a sanitized nationalistic version of state history focused heavily on free enterprise, you must inevitably reduce the time spent on global perspectives, diverse cultures, and complex marginalized narratives.
Just run out of time.
You are literally budgeting them out of existence.
And while these state battles are stalling out in California or raging on in Florida and Texas, the source material notes a massive, terrifying escalation.
Yes, a huge shift.
Because this conflict over who controls the narrative didn't just stay at the state level. It has officially jumped to the highest level of the federal government. We have to talk about the unprecedented federal actions that happened in early 2025.
We do. The McWilson paper highlights two massive executive orders that significantly escalate this fight. Historically, the federal government has stayed out of local curriculum battle.
Right, they leave it to the states.
Usually.
Yeah.
But these orders attempt to use federal leverage to override both state and local district control entirely. The first is Executive Order 14190, issued on January 29, 2025. It is titled Ending Radical Indoctrination in K-12 Schooling.
Ending Radical Indoctrination. That is quite a title.
It's very direct.
What is the actual mechanism of this order? Like, how does the president dictate what a local school in Ohio does?
The mechanism is the purse strings. The order directs federal agencies to identify and potentially rescind federal funding that is tied to what it calls gender ideology or discriminatory equity ideology in K-12 curricula and teacher training programs.
Wait, pulling federal funding?
Yes. Federal funding, like Title I money for low-income schools, is a lifeline for local districts. The order weaponizes that funding, threatening to pull it if a school teaches concepts the administration deems radical.
Wow.
It also explicitly revives the 1776 Commission, which was a project designed to promote a very specific, singular vision of patriotic education.
So it's using the threat of bankrupting local schools to force them to drop certain curricula. That is a massive escalation of power. But the second order, issued a few months later, I think is even more shocking because of who it targets.
Yes, on March 27, 2025, an order titled Restoring Truth and Sanity to American History was issued. And this one didn't just target K-12 schools.
Who did it target?
It directed the Smithsonian Board of Regents to remove what it called improper ideology from its museums and research centers.
The Smithsonian.
Mm-hmm.
We are talking about the preeminent historical institution in the world.
Exactly. The order explicitly barred federal appropriations for exhibits that, quote, divide Americans based on race. It didn't stop at vague threats either. It named specific targets.
Like what?
It specifically named an American Art Museum exhibit on race and sculpture, and it directly criticized the National Museum of African American History and Culture for its discussion of white culture.
Unbelievable.
Furthermore, it directed the immediate reinstatement of various historical monuments that had been removed since January 2020.
I am genuinely astounded by the Smithsonian inclusion. It is one thing to use financial leverage to dictate what goes into a 7th grade geography textbook. We've established that happens all the time through the state adoption boards.
Right.
But dictating the specific curatorial choices in the National Museum of African American History and Culture, they are essentially taking the K-12 textbook sanitization rules, the demand for a family history that doesn't cause anguish, and applying them to the highest level of adult public historical curation in the country. It completely destroys the concept of curatorial independence.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it represents a fundamental, paradigm-shifting shift in American governance. Historically, curriculum was a state and local battleground. That was the whole point of non-adoption states. But these 2025 executive orders attempt to nationalize the restrictive approach. They are attempting to use the federal purse strings to enforce a unified, sanitized, patriotic narrative across the entire country, regardless of what a local school board in Ohio or an AP teacher in Massachusetts or a PhD museum curator in Washington, D.C. might want.
And the historians did not take this quietly, did they?
Absolutely not. The pushback was severe. The American Historical Association and the Organization of American Historians, which are the two premier professional bodies for historians in the United States, issued a joint statement vehemently opposing EO 14190.
Good for them.
They recognize exactly what this mechanism is. It is an attempt to replace historical inquiry with state-mandated mythology.
Okay, I want to ask you to step back with me for a second. We've covered a massive amount of ground today. We've talked about multi-million-dollar textbook boardrooms, the Stop Woke Act, the College Board capitulating, and presidential executive orders targeting the Smithsonian.
It's a lot.
It is a dizzying amount of current events from 2023 to 2026. But to truly understand why this battle is so fierce and why the stakes over a 7th grade textbook are so incredibly high, we have to look backward.
With you?
We have to look back 90 years to a man who diagnosed this exact mechanism long before the AP framework or the Big Three ever existed.
The McWilson paper concludes with a brilliant historical synthesis, bringing in the foundational work of Dr. Carter G. Woodson.
Yes. Tell us about Woodson. Who was he and what was the core thesis of his 1933 text?
So Carter G. Woodson is widely known as the father of Black history. He was the second African American to earn a PhD from Harvard, following W.E.B. Du Bois, and he actually founded what eventually became Black History Month.
A towering figure.
Absolutely. And in 1933, he published a seminal prophetic book called The Miseducation of the Negro. And his core critique, formulated nearly a century ago, perfectly describes the data, the audits, and the sanitization mechanisms we are seeing today.
What was his main argument?
Woodson argued that the American schooling system was deliberately designed to center European and Euro-American history and culture at the intentional exclusion of all others. He recognized that this wasn't an oversight. It was a mechanism of control.
Has anyone ever pointed out the psychological toll this takes on the students themselves before now? Because we've talked about all the political battles, but what did Woodson say this does to the mind of a child?
Woodson argued it had a devastating dual effect. For white students, he said this Eurocentric curriculum gave them an inflated sense of significance. It taught them that they were the primary necessary actors in human history.
And for Black students?
For Black students, the total omission of their history, their brilliance, and their perspective pushed them toward internalized racial myths. It systematically disconnected them from their own legacy and their capacity for self-determination.
The source cites a brilliant piece from February 2023 in The Atlantic by Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, who explicitly connects Woodson's 90-year-old critique to the present-day battles. Kendi specifically looks at the battle over that AP African American Studies course we talked about earlier. Kendi notes that Harvard historian Jarvis R. Givens, who helped design the AP course, did so explicitly to reflect the very diversity of thought, the complex historical inquiry that Woodson was calling for back in 1933.
And that is why the state of Florida's rejection of that AP course and the College Board's subsequent scrubbing of Black scholars is so deeply resonant with Woodson's fears.
It's history repeating itself.
Literally. Woodson had a chilling diagnostic tool. He wrote that the education of people should begin with themselves. But he also made a profound observation about the mechanics of power.
What was that?
He noted that if you can control a person's thinking, you do not have to worry about their actions.
Yeah.
He famously said that you do not have to tell a miseducated person to go to the back door. They will go without being told.
Wow. If you control a person's thinking, you do not have to worry about their actions. That is chilling.
It is the ultimate distillation of why this matters. When we view the entire scope of this deep dive through Woodson's lens, the stakes become crystal clear.
Yeah.
The fight over the big three adoption states, the publisher profit motives forcing nationwide standardization, the state mandates scrubbing authors like bell hooks, the unfunded mandates in California, the federal executive orders targeting the Smithsonian. These are not just partisan political games. They are not just bureaucratic squabbles over textbook contracts.
No, they are existential.
They are a fundamental, ongoing battle over self-determination. It is a battle over whether public education will serve as a tool of empowerment, giving students the analytical tools to understand the complex, often painful, but deeply real history of their nation and themselves, or whether it will serve as a tool of control.
Designed to uphold a very specific, sanitized family history that protects the current hierarchy of power. So what does this all mean? Woodson realized in 1933 that a curriculum built around one people's centrality at the expense of others isn't a bureaucratic accident. It's not a typo in a geography book. It's a feature of the system.
A well-designed feature.
Yeah. And the fact that we are sitting here reading Jim Amat Dogon McWilson's paper in 2026, making the exact same point, proving with massive SPLC audits and APM revenue data that the erasure is still happening right now, proves that whose history is taught is still an open, raging war.
It is a war fought in the margins of textbooks, in the line items of state budgets, in the wording of 8th grade math problems, and in the language of executive orders.
Right.
And as long as a few massive buyers in adoption states control the economic survival of the publishers, the narrative will always skew toward the demands of those holding the purse strings rather than the demands of historical truth.
Which brings us back to you listening to this. The history you learned in school, the walls and windows of your own historical understanding, were likely shaped not just by the objective facts of what happened in the past.
No, not at all.
They were shaped by the profit margins of a corporate publisher in New York, desperately trying to appease a politically appointed review board in Texas, California, or Florida before a printing deadline. The things you don't know about American history aren't just things you forgot. They are often things that were deliberately removed because they were deemed too dangerous or too unprofitable to teach you.
Your worldview was, in part, economically negotiated before you ever opened the book.
It is a lot to process, but I want to leave you with a final, slightly futuristic thought to mull over. It wasn't in McWilson's paper, but it feels incredibly relevant to where we are heading. We spent this entire deep dive talking about the massive centralized monopoly of the big three states and these giant textbook publishers.
Right.
Carter G. Woodson's great fear was this centralized master narrative, erasing diverse truths. But right now, we are seeing the rapid, explosive rise of generative AI in the classroom.
Oh, yes. The technological landscape is shifting completely away from the physical textbook.
Exactly. We might very soon see a near future where personalized AI tutors generate custom, real-time curriculums for every single student on a tablet. On one hand, that completely shatters the model we just spent an hour discussing.
It bypasses the big three adoption states entirely.
It breaks the publisher monopolies. No more one-size-fits-all textbooks. But on the other hand, if every student in America is learning a completely customized, distinct version of history tailored to their parents' exact political preferences and local cultural bubbles, do we ever share a common reality again?
That is the big question.
Does a hyper-personalized AI history solve Carter G. Woodson's fear of a centralized master narrative, or does it just create a million fractured realities? Does the ultimate form of local control mean the end of a shared national history altogether?
That is a profound question. If the architecture of the mind is entirely customized to our existing biases, do we lose the shared foundational knowledge, even a flawed one, that holds a society together?
It's something to deeply think about the next time you hear a debate over what goes into a classroom or what an AI is teaching a child. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the walls around you. Keep examining the sources of the information you consume every day, and we'll see you next time.